How's it going, guys? Welcome to another video, and this is going to be how to help your performance in games. And this is going to be a completely software-based tutorial, so we're not going to be upgrading any hardware in the computer, which would obviously be the most efficient option, and you'd see the most performance boost from that. But this is going to be totally free, little things you can tweak, and what can majorly help your performance in games. So the first one, and please note that these aren't going to be any huge shifts. There's not going to be one button you magically click and you're getting 30 more frames per second. These are going to be minor performance increases depending on how your system is. So first thing we're going to do is edit the system settings for the game you're playing. So if you have a GeForce graphics card, you can download this GeForce Experience, and this can help you a little faster. So you can just click on a game and go to details. But if you don't, just open the game that you're playing, go to the settings on the main menu, and you can have all these options as well. Now, for the GeForce thing, it'll automatically set some optimal settings for you, what it thinks will run the best on your computer, but you can change these and edit them to your current one. And then obviously, if you don't have this, just change them from the settings in the game. So one of the biggest things of these settings that can help your performance, one thing I would say is anti-aliasing. I'd recommend just turning that off if you're seeing any trouble with performance. It's not that big of a difference noticing in the game, and it can help you boost a little bit. The second biggest thing I would say is the resolution. So the resolution should generally match the resolution of your monitor, and if it doesn't, like if it's higher than your monitor, that doesn't really make any sense, so I'd automatically lower that. But you can lower this. Now, the only caveat with this is if you lower it, you're going to notice more how blurry it gets very fast. But one thing I found that you can do, and back when I had like a really low system, really cheap system, was run your game in windowed mode and run this resolution at you can run it like even a third of your screen resolution. So you would run the game at like a third or a quarter of the resolution, but you would just have the game run in windowed mode. So let's say your game would run like this. So now your completely monitor, let's say it's 1080p, but now you're running the game only in this resolution. So your graphics card only has to push out, a quarter of the pixels that it was before. So it can help a lot with performance. And if you're okay with the game not filling up your whole screen, then perfect for you. Otherwise, you can run it maxed out in the screen at just a lower resolution. You'll just notice it looks a little blurrier and not as crisp. But that is a huge factor that can save you a lot of frames per second. It's just obviously not going to look as good. Other things you can mess around with: texture quality. Textures usually do take up a lot more space, and they take longer time to load on your computer. Shadows I've found not to be as crazy. You can keep them on low or medium, and I feel like they don't change as much, at least in my experience, with all that stuff. And then other games have like water textures and specific stuff like that, and you can mess around with those. I would recommend just turning everything down to the lowest, seeing how it performs. Hopefully it performs good, and then just slowly tweaking things up to see where you meet that level of oh, okay, now I'm losing performance, and just play at that, because until you get actual new hardware, you're going to be limited in how well you want the game to actually look on your computer. Alright, so the second thing is, and this is specific to if you don't have a lot of RAM in your computer. So your RAM in your computer is basically where your processor stores the information it's currently using to access faster. So if you have an issue where you're seeing that if you open your task manager and your RAM is maxed out when you're playing your game, you notice things might stutter or lag, or maybe loading times are longer or something. I'd recommend trying to close any programs that you're not currently using. So if you go in here and you see you have a lot of programs that are open, just close some of those, because they are stored. The memory for those are stored in your RAM, taking up space. But if you're only going to be gaming at that 1 hour period or whatever, then close anything you're not using to free up some RAM so that your game can use it. And that way you can, your game can utilize more space so it doesn't freeze up so often or lag out. Another thing you can do is set part of your hard drive as RAM, and I have a video on that, so I will link that in the description if you want to check that out. So you can actually take a portion of your hard drive space and basically set it as almost like an emergency backup of RAM, so that way when your computer runs out of RAM, it can use that space instead. It'll obviously be a bit slower, but it can still help out in some situations. And then the only other thing, there are some programs out there you'll find that will be like Game Booster or some weird names that say oh, you just click it, activate, and it boosts your games. I find that these basically end up just closing programs that you don't need. So they're not that useful, and they don't do as much as you would think. But other than that, guys, there's really not a lot you can do to save some performance besides upgrading the hardware in your computer. You're very limited in software. One more thing you could do is look into overclocking, but if you are on a budget and you do have a cheaper system, I highly doubt that you have a processor. If you're on Intel, you'd have to have a K processor and the board to support it. AMD, you'd have to have the board to support overclocking, and you'd have to have a sufficient cooler so that you can keep the CPU cold enough so that way it's not going to overheat. So if you have those situations, this is most likely not going to be used, considering I would recommend spending more money on the hardware than more money on a cooling solution. But if you're in that situation, I'd recommend looking up some other videos on how to overclock, and that can help you a bit, but that can be dangerous if obviously you don't have the correct hardware to properly cool your components. So other than that, guys, sorry, there's really not a lot you can do to increase your performance besides lowering all your settings and trying to free up some RAM space by closing programs and whatnot. Other than that, I would highly recommend upgrading your computer. CPU and GPU are going to be the most prominent components that are going to affect your gameplay. You can get like an SSD, and yes, that can help load times and whatnot, but that'll more help like day-to-day stuff that you're doing. But the GPU and the CPU will be the biggest factors depending on the game, because some games use more than others, so it all depends on what kind of game you're playing. But in the end, software is very limited in what you can do to increase your performance. So I hope this video helped out a little bit, to at least give you some more insight into what you can do and what you have available to do when trying to increase your performance in games. If you guys have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. I'd love to answer them, and maybe create another video on upgrading hardware and more into specifically what hardware to get, maybe for like a specific game. So if you're interested in that, let me know. Please subscribe if you find this anywhat interesting and you want to see more of this, and I'll see you guys in the next one.